Hi again, everybody. This is Chapter 3, so we are going to move into Chapter 3 in our textbook, which deals with human movement. So basically, you're looking at anatomy and a little bit of kinesiology and physiology. So a lot of information in this chapter, and in our program, really, we need to have a good, solid understanding of some basic anatomy and some basic physiology. So hopefully you have had your bios, your biology classes already, or maybe you're taking it concurrently right now this semester with this particular course. That's going to definitely help you understand this material even more. So this is kind of just a brief overview of some basic anatomy. I do have another video that I'd like you to watch that's about 30 minutes long, but it does walk you through the planes and all the different muscle groups and the actions at those particular muscle groups and what they do as far as at each joint. So that's something that you're going to need to understand. So things that you're going to cover in this particular chapter is applying the human movement principles to our instruction as a group fitness instructor. We're going to look at the different energy pathways and then the 3-zone intensity way to measure intensity model. We're going to also look at the different categories and phases of the ACE integrated fitness training model that they have developed. Also, you need to demonstrate that basic understanding of gross anatomy, looking specifically at certain bones, specific muscles, and then also looking at the 10 basic body positions commonly used in group fitness instruction, and then applying this in a laboratory-based format where we're going to be doing some things in class where you're going to have to identify muscle groups, talk about the action of that particular muscle group and how it impacts that joint, and then take us through different exercises that strengthen that particular muscle. So we're going to apply what we're learning in this chapter in our actual face-to-face class. So looking at stability and mobility, we have a lot of different joints in our body, and some joints offer mobility while others offer and provide more stability. So all joints demonstrate varying levels of each. They tend to favor one over the other depending on their function within our body. So the differences between stability and mobility is that joint stability is the ability to maintain or control joint movement or a position. So it is achieved by the structures of our joints and the neuromuscular system. Joint mobility, on the other hand, is the range of motion around a joint or a body segment. It's achieved by the structures of the joints and the neuromuscular system as well. So again, certain joints, as you can see as you look through this kinetic chain, offer more mobility. They provide more of a range of motion, while other joints serve as a point of stability for our body. In the video that I'm going to have you watch that corresponds with this, it does go through the different planes of motion, so I'm going to have you just watch that video separately. So I'm just going to move ahead and just briefly talk about these 3 different planes. So our body is divided into 3 different planes. So you have your transverse plane, which basically separates the body into upper and lower halves. You have your frontal plane, which separates the body into anterior, front, and posterior, back halves. And then you have your sagittal, which separates the body into right and left halves. So when I think of a plane, I think of it as an intersection. So if I'm doing movements that occur in the sagittal plane, for example, I have this wall that kind of cuts the body right in half. So I can't break that wall. I can't hit it when I do these types of movements. So anything that occurs in the sagittal plane is going to be forward or backwards. So we're not breaking or hitting that wall. We're staying within that plane of motion. So things like flexion, extension are big movements that occur in that sagittal plane. Frontal plane, same thing. Think of having that wall that kind of separates the body in front and back halves. So we can't hit that wall. So we have to do movements that are more lateral or side to side. So things like abduction and adduction are great examples of movements that occur in that frontal plane. And then transverse, those would be more of a rotational, so if we're doing like a rotational or a twisting type movement, those are movements that are going to occur in that transverse plane. So we have 5 primary movement patterns that really occur in daily life. And the reason we talk about this is because we want to train those patterns. We want to make everyday movements for people easier. We want them to be able to, perform functional movements, which are things that we do in everyday life, easier. We want to make that easier for them. So these are some pretty common movement patterns that you see quite often. So you have your bend and lift, so maybe raising and lowering movements, like squatting down to pick up an object off the floor, or standing up from a chair, so you're bending and you're lifting. Single leg movements like walking or lunging, or even climbing upstairs. Pushing open a door, putting something away on a tall shelf, propping yourself up from a sideline position, so you're pushing yourself up. Pulling, opening up a car door, right? You're pulling. And rotational movements, turning to throw something away behind you or reaching across your body to buckle up your seatbelt. So we want to try to incorporate these movement patterns as much as possible into our group fitness environment. That way, these activities of daily living that we just perform on a day-to-day basis can become easier for people. Also, we want to create balance in group exercise. So, for example, if we're doing a bunch of lunges on the right side of the body with the right leg, we obviously want to achieve balance and do it on the left side of the body as well. Directional movements, we don't want to stay in one plane or one direction. So if I did side step, side to side, I also want to try to involve maybe forward and backward movements. And therefore, I'm working in all planes of motion. Also, for your overall fitness program considerations, we want to take into account those health-related components of fitness. So making sure that we're doing something within our class that's going to promote cardiorespiratory endurance, it's going to promote muscle fitness, and it's going to promote flexibility in some way, shape, or form. And many of our classes can be well-rounded and detailed out, so we can have things in there that are going to help to promote each one of those areas. Let's take just a few minutes and talk about energy pathways. So this is where the exercise physiology comes into play. And we look at the roles of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. So those are our energy yielding nutrients. So in order for your body to produce energy, it has to consume, or it has to have carbohydrate, it has to have fat, and it has to have protein. Now your body's number one preferred source of fuel is definitely carbohydrate. Right? Your body craves, demands carbohydrate. Also, fat is another big source of fuel for our body. Protein isn't necessarily the number one choice as far as a fuel source, but your body will use protein as an energy source in times of starvation or when we have low carb intake and things like that. But our exercise intensity and the duration really determines the fuel sources that we use. So generally, there's an inverse relationship between exercise intensity and duration. So the more intense the workout, the less time participants are able to maintain that intensity. When people work at hard intensities for a few minutes, they use up their carbohydrate stores. They use up all of those carbohydrate stores normally. When people work at moderate and low intensities for longer than a few minutes, they use a combination of carb and fat. So looking at those 3 energy pathways, the first one is your phosphagen energy pathway, and that will supply energy for us for only a few seconds of all-out work. Once we've depleted that phosphagen or that creatine phosphate that's already stored in our skeletal muscle, your body then can move into the glycolytic anaerobic system, which can go for several minutes. Now this is where you're using primarily carbohydrate. If we run out of carbohydrate, or if we slow our pace down, or our intensity level goes down to a low to a moderate intensity, we move into what's called the aerobic energy system, which uses fat primarily as an energy source. So your body can shift between the use of carb to fat depending on the intensity level that you're exercising. So for example, as you're sitting right now watching this PowerPoint presentation, your body's using primarily fat as an energy source. Now you're not burning a whole lot of calories sitting there, but when we are at rest and when we do low intensity exercise, fat is the primary energy source. Versus when we do moderate to high intensity physical activity, your body shifts more towards carbohydrate as an energy source. So that's just kind of a brief description of those different energy pathways. Also, we look at the 3-zone intensity model. Now, this is just a way that we use sometimes to monitor physical intensity as we do exercise. So the 3 zones are separated by each participant's unique metabolic markers, known as the first ventilatory threshold, where talking becomes a little challenging, and the second ventilatory threshold, where talking becomes very difficult and is reduced to 1 or 2 words at a time. So zone 1 is generally known as low to moderate intensity exercise, during which the exerciser can talk comfortably. So if we say we want to stay within zone 1, they should be able to talk comfortably, carry on a conversation while they're exercising with you. Zone 2 is moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, during which talking is a little challenging, but still possible. Maybe not having complete sentences, but they can, put some words together. And zone 3 is vigorous to very vigorous intensity, during which the exerciser definitely cannot talk comfortably. So generally, most folks are going to stay between that zone 1 and that zone 2 when we do aerobic exercise. They should be able to talk, have a few words, but if they're completely winded and they can't get a few words out, that's sometimes too intense for most of the general population. The ACE integrated fitness training model, this consists of 2 components, each of which is then divided into 4 phases that run parallel to their function. So we've got function, health, fitness, and performance on the continuum. Rapport is the foundation for success during all these phases. So whether the exerciser is a highly motivated fitness enthusiast or a sedentary adult looking to adopt more healthful habits. So you can, again, see how rapport, right here on the bottom, is the key. Right? We want to make sure that we build that rapport with our clientele, with our group fitness participants, and that way it helps us to motivate them. As far as cardiorespiratory endurance and performance, you can see it's broken down into 4 phases. During that first phase, we are looking at just aerobic base training. We want to, again, stay within that zone 1 in that 3-zone model. Phase 2, you're doing aerobic efficiency training where you're going to increase the intensity slightly. You're still working in zone 1, but now you're also progressing to zone 2. So you're doing not only low, but up to moderate intensity aerobic exercise. Phase 3, we can start incorporating some anaerobic exercise, maybe some high intensity interval training, for example, where we're working more in that anaerobic system as far as energy. Now we're in the zone 3. And then anaerobic power, when we add power to it, power means jump, right? So we're adding power, we're jumping, we're getting off the ground. Both feet are leaving the ground. You're working in zone 3 as well. For functional movement and resistance training, phase 1, we really want to work on stability and mobility. So we can do some basic assessments to see where our clients are, our participants are, but really working on range of motion at each joint. Then phase 2, we can work on movement training. So focus primarily on those 5 movements, right? The bend and lift, the push, the pull, the rotational things. Then we can start adding load. It's always good to get the movement down first before we start adding load, adding external resistance to it. And then lastly, performance training is the last phase here, where that's where we can start incorporating things like speed, agility training, quickness, things like that. Also in this chapter it does get into some basic anatomy. Now, as far as bones go, there are 206 bones in the human body. They're not all listed here, of course, in this picture, but you in this particular course will need to know some of those major bones, right? The major bones of the leg, the major bones of the arm, right? Looking at the appendicular and axial skeleton. So I think it would be a great idea if you look under our week 2 module, and I do provide some different quizzes that are free websites, and there's one for bones. I would definitely suggest you run through and quiz yourself and get a familiar understanding of some of the basic and major bones in the human body. Also, looking at the spine. So you can see here, the spine is comprised of cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, and then you have your sacrum and your coccyx. So here in your cervical vertebrae, we have 7. Thoracic vertebrae, we have 12. Lumbar, we have 5. Your sacrum is actually fused, 5 vertebrae that are fused together, and your coccyx is actually 4 vertebrae that are fused together. So as far as maintaining a neutral anatomical spine, that's really important and something we want to cue a lot during group exercise. So we want to maintain this normal curvature, as you can see here. So the cervical spine, you can see there's just a slight anterior curve, not too much, but it's slightly going to the front. Through the thoracic spine, you can see there's a slight posterior curve. And then back down to the lumbar spine, you can see another slight anterior curve in that spine. That's the natural curvature of our spinal column, and that's what we want to maintain during group exercise. So it's important to cue things like keeping your head and neck neutral. You know, if you thrust your head all the way back and your chin up to the sky, you're definitely not keeping that cervical spine in neutral alignment. So instead of that, maybe saying something like keep your head looking straight at your mat. So say you're in a plank position, you're up on your elbows, right, and you're looking straight at the mat. That's maintaining neutral spine and helping to keep that cervical spine in that neutral position. So if you look on page 43 in your textbook, table 3-1, there are some sample anatomical cues in there that can be very helpful for that. Also, group fitness instructors should know where each major muscle group is located. So the next set of slides I'm going to kind of run through quickly because the separate video that I'm going to have you watch really breaks down each muscle group separately, and it goes through the actions, how it affects and impacts a particular joint, and demonstrates those particular actions. So I won't spend more time in this video doing so. But first of all, looking at that pelvic floor, you can see the muscles of the pelvic floor act in stabilization, support. They help to brace your core, right? So when you're engaging your core during things like crunches and sit-ups, you know, you're also using that pelvic floor. Your transverse abdominis, which is basically the deepest of your abdominal muscles, you can see pictured here. So your rectus abdominis is kind of torn away, and underneath you see that transverse abdominis where the fibers kind of run straight across or parallel with the floor, I guess you could say. This one really acts mainly in compressing the abdomen, right? So in other words, when you tell your folks to push their belly button to their backbone when they're laying on the mat on their back, they are engaging the TVA, the transverse abdominis muscle. Rectus abdominis is another one that flexes the spine. So for example, when you crunch up, you're using that rectus abdominis, that's flexion. Your obliques, you have your external where you can see the fibers run down and in. And then your internal where the fibers run up in the opposite direction. So if you tore away the external obliques, deep to those, you can see the internal obliques here. So those act in rotation mainly. So if we are, holding a medicine ball and we're rotating side to side, that is external internal oblique. Lateral flexion would be, maybe standing up and bending to the side, like taking your elbow and putting it down into your pocket, like a side bend. That's also working your external and internal obliques. Your erector spinae is consisted of these three muscles, longissimus, spinalis, and iliocostalis. Those are deep, deep back muscles that extend the spine. So if you're doing like a back extension or a back arch, type thing, that's the erector spinae. And then quadratus lumborum is actually going to be deep here, you can see. Posteriorly is where you can see it the best, but that's also going to act in laterally flexing your spine. Upper body muscle groups, you can see your pectorals, and anteriorly your pectoralis major, and then you can see posteriorly you have your upper, middle, and lower trapezius. That's quite a large muscle group. It's very extensive. And then deep to that trapezius, you can see your rhomboids. You can see the minor on the top there, and then the major on the bottom. So your pectorals do shoulder flexion and extension, adduction, horizontal adduction, whereas your trapezius and your rhomboids do a lot of things. They act on that scapula, so they elevate it. They adduct your scapula, they depress your scapula. So they do a lot of different actions on that scapula. And then, of course, you've got your deltoids. Okay, so your deltoids is basically your shoulder. So your shoulder's going to flex and abduct and do horizontal adduction and abduction. And then your lats will do shoulder extension, adduction, and horizontal abduction. So lots of different actions going on for each one of those different muscles. Bicep. Bicep is the front of the upper arm here. That flexes the elbow. And then tricep is the back of the upper arm, and that's going to extend the elbow. And then, of course, the hip flexors and hip extensors, they kind of give it away as to what they do. But you can see here, muscles that act on flexing the hip are all located here. Your tensor fasciae latae, your sartorius, your rectus femoris. Please note that your rectus femoris is the only one of the four quadricep muscles that act on two joints. It acts on the knee, it extends the knee, and it acts on the hip. It flexes the hip. Why does it do that? Because it crosses both joints, and so that's how it can impact both. You also have your psoas major, psoas minor, and your iliacus. So all of these muscles as a whole act in flexing your hips. So if you lift your knee up to your chest, that's hip flexion. Your extensors, on the other hand, are your hamstrings. So you got your semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and your bicep femoris. Those are going to extend the hip along with your gluteus maximus. So just thinking back to those hip flexors, ask yourself, what are some specific stretches that you could incorporate at the end of, say, a sports conditioning class to stretch your hip flexors? Think about that for a second. Remember, the hip flexors are the muscles that, if you're lifting your knee up to your chest, for example, that's flexion of the hip. How can I lengthen those muscles? I did want to take a minute and just show you. ACE has a great database. It's an exercise library. So here you can see, as far as the, I'm trying to get the website to pop up, but it's acefitness.org/ and all I put in was exercise library. And then you're going to come to this particular page, and it has different exercises by body part. So it has a whole list of different exercises by body part, exercises by experience, depending on what fitness level you are, and then exercises by equipment. Pretty cool, huh? Then they have some videos as well. So here you can see, we were just talking about hip flexors. So right here, the kneeling hip flexor stretch. So if I view the details of this exercise, you can see that it's a beginner level exercise. There's no equipment needed. What body part does it work? The hips, the legs, the thighs. So you can see it gives you the step-by-step instruction of how to do it, and then a short little video, start, to finish, what that looks like. So I just wanted to share this with you because it will help in programming, as far as, putting exercises together maybe for the strength segment of your class or different segments of your class altogether. So I wanted to share that with you. So that's a great stretch for your hip flexors, okay? Also, quadriceps and hamstrings. Your quads are the muscles on the front of the thigh. So you have 4 muscles that comprise your quadricep: rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, intermedius, and medialis. So your quadriceps act on the knee primarily. So they extend your knee. The only one that's different is that rectus femoris. Remember, that also flexes the hip in addition to extending the knee. And then your hamstrings, the muscles on the back of the thigh, there are 3 that comprise your hamstrings: semitendinosus, semimembranosus, bicep femoris. Those are going to flex the knee. Okay, they act in knee flexion. And then you've got your hip abductors. Abduction, remember, is bringing it away from the midline. So if you were doing like a side leg raise, so these muscles act on the hip and they help to abduct the hip. So the tensor fasciae latae, that IT band, which is this broad band of connective tissue that runs along the outer edge of the leg, your gluteus medius, and then your gluteus maximus. Those are all going to help to abduct your hip. And on the other hand, you have your adductors of the hip, so bringing your leg back to the midline. So your adductor longus, gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor brevis, and pectineus. These are all muscles that are going to help with hip adduction. And then the muscles of your lower leg, you have your anterior tibialis that runs along your tibia. And that is going to help to dorsiflex your ankle, so lifting the toes up to the sky, for example. And then you have your gastrocnemius, which is on the back of your leg. And deep underneath of that, you have your soleus. And those are going to plantar flex your ankle. So when you point your toes, that's plantar flexion. So also the video that we were talking, or that I wanted you to watch, is going to talk about these different body positions. You're going to be doing some exercises in class that are going to look at these different body positions as well. So we're not going to get into those very much in this particular video, but we will be doing some exercises together in class looking at this. And then lastly, looking at posture. Neutral posture is preferred. So like I said, we want to maintain that normal curvature of our spine. So people who have exaggerated postures, for example, lordosis is when we have an excessive anterior curvature of that lumbar spine. So you can see it's curved quite a bit further forward. So what happens there is the pelvis, you can see, is kind of shifted forward a little bit. I always think of our pelvis as a bowl, right? We want our bowl to be upright so it doesn't tip the contents or spill the contents out of it. So if we have a lordotic, if we're in lordosis and that lumbar spine is pushed forward like this, the pelvis is rotated forward, and that can lead to misalignment at our joints, and it can lead to a lot of pain for people, maybe at their hips, for example. So women who are, for example, in their, last term of pregnancy, gravity is pulling their belly forward, and therefore that kind of makes them go into this lordotic posture. People who are heavier, who have a lot of weight in that front region, that is one big reason why people suffer from lordosis. Kyphosis, on the other hand, is having an exaggerated posterior curve of the thoracic spine. So you can see it's definitely curved way further back than normal. That also has an impact on, our pelvis. It can tilt it anteriorly as well. And so therefore we kind of see that slouched posture with a lot of people who are in kyphosis. And then of course a lot of people have what's called scoliosis, which is an excessive lateral curvature of the spine. So you can see this is definitely a scoliosis for a person, which in turn you can see there's definite misalignment here at the hip. One sacrum is definitely higher than the other, and that can cause misalignment at different joints, which is going to impact them down the line. Maybe their hips are going to hurt, and then as a result of that, their knees might start hurting, their ankles might start hurting. It can go through that kinetic chain. So definitely maintaining that neutral posture is very important. And as a group fitness instructor, we want to cue to folks to maintain that neutral posture. So standing straight up, opening up the chest, keeping your shoulders back when you're standing, doing exercises, we want to reinforce that proper posture. So in class, we're going to do two different labs this particular week. The first one is going to deal with those 5 major movement patterns and looking at what are some actions that can occur at those particular joints during that movement pattern. And then also, we're going to develop some strength training exercises for some different muscle groups. And you're going to be actually presenting that in class and talking about your muscle group and explaining, how it impacts that particular joint that you're going to be focused on. And then also, you're going to be demonstrating those exercises and cueing us through how to perform them. So lots of practical activities centered around this will happen in class. So lots of information in this chapter. We could spend a whole semester on physiology. We could spend a whole semester on biology. But that's why, you're taking those key courses separately for the entire semester. So this is just kind of a brief overview of that basic anatomy, basic physiology, kinesiology type of thing.